The island rose from the Hudson River like a broken tooth, jagged and dark against the water that moved around it without pause, without mercy, without memory. Smoke no longer rose from its ruins, but the smell remained. Burnt metal, scorched stone, the acrid residue of chemicals that had combusted decades ago and left their signature in the air, in the soil, in the very bones of the place. It was August when the arsenal exploded, when the island that had been built to contain violence became violence itself, when walls designed to hold destruction were consumed by what they held. The blast shattered windows in towns 3 miles distant. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder that would not end, echoing off mountains, reverberating through forests, reaching ears that would remember it forever. People who heard it stopped what they were doing, stopped mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath, and turned toward the river, toward the column of smoke rising black and thick, toward the island that had always seemed ominous, and now proved why. They stood watching as flames consumed what Francis Bannerman had spent 20 years building, watching as his castle of commerce became a castle of ash. The walls remained standing. That was the strange thing, the terrible thing, the thing that turned tragedy into legend. The explosion gutted the interior, melted metal, vaporized wood, killed everything combustible, but the walls stood. They stand still, hollow shells that frame emptiness, monuments to the moment when ambition met fire and fire won. The fortress exploded from within. Francis Bannerman VI was not born to build castles. He was born in Dundee, Scotland in 1851, son of a tailor who understood that fabric and thread were honest trades but would never make a man wealthy. The family immigrated to Brooklyn when Francis was 3, carrying little except determination and the belief that America rewarded those willing to work harder than others, longer than others, without complaint or rest. Francis began working at age 11, not in factories or shipyards like other immigrant boys, but in salvage. His father had discovered a niche buying surplus materials from the Civil War, uniforms, tents, equipment the government no longer needed, and would sell cheap to anyone with cash and storage. Young Francis took to it immediately, understanding instinctively that one man's waste was another man's inventory. He had a gift for seeing value where others saw junk. A crate of broken rifles could be repaired and sold. Torn uniforms could be mended or cut apart for fabric. Rusty bayonets could be sharpened. Spent shells could be melted down. Nothing was worthless. Everything had potential. Everything could be transformed, repackaged, resold at profit to someone who needed it or thought they did. By 1870, at 19 years old, Francis had his own business. By 1880, he had outgrown 3 warehouses. By 1890, he was the largest military surplus dealer in America, buying decommissioned equipment from the Spanish-American War, from conflicts in the Philippines, from the government's perpetual need to refresh its arsenal and dispose of the old. He dealt in guns primarily, thousands of rifles, pistols, carbines, artillery pieces. He bought them by the ton, stored them in warehouses that filled entire city blocks, cataloged them in ledgers where each weapon was a number, a price, a unit of inventory. He sold to collectors, to foreign governments, to adventurers heading to frontier territories, to anyone with money and a reason to need firepower. But New York City grew anxious about a man who kept enough weapons to arm a small nation in the middle of Brooklyn. Neighbors complained. Newspapers published concerned editorials. Fire marshals issued warnings. The police visited regularly, not to arrest but to remind, to suggest, to make clear that storing ammunition and gunpowder in residential neighborhoods was a problem seeking a solution. Francis needed a new location, somewhere isolated, somewhere safe, somewhere he could build not just a warehouse, but a fortress, a facility so secure that no one could question his right to store whatever he purchased. He found it in 1900. Polypel Island, a 7-acre rock in the Hudson River, 50 miles north of New York City, uninhabited, unwanted, available for purchase. The island had history. Native tribes avoided it, believing it cursed. Dutch settlers called it polypel, meaning ladle, because its shape resembled a cooking implement. During the Revolution, both sides ignored it, considering it too small, too exposed, too useless for fortification. It existed for centuries as a blank space, a rock that served no purpose except to be there, waiting. Francis saw potential. The island's isolation was an advantage. No neighbors to complain, no fire marshals to inspect, no police to question. Just water on all sides, distance from population centers, and bedrock strong enough to support structures that would make people stop and stare. He bought it for a modest sum from New York State, which was happy to sell land that generated no revenue and served no function. Construction began in 1901. Francis designed the buildings himself, rejecting architects who wanted to create practical warehouses and insisting on something grander, something memorable, something that would advertise his business to every ship passing on the Hudson. He would build a castle, not a replica, not a theme park, a real castle with towers and battlements and walls thick enough to withstand artillery fire. The design borrowed from Scottish fortresses Francis remembered from childhood. Square towers rose at corners. Crenellated walls connected them. Arrow slits punctured the stone. A massive gate faced the river, iron-bound and imposing. The name Bannerman was carved into the facade in letters 3 feet tall, visible from the opposite shore, a declaration that this place belonged to him, that he had built it, that it would outlast him. But beneath the medieval aesthetic lay modern purpose. The castle was a warehouse. Behind those romantic walls sat shelving units holding rifles. Inside those towers were stairways leading to storage rooms filled with ammunition. Under that courtyard were cellars packed with gunpowder, explosives, artillery shells, everything necessary to wage war or to sell to those who would. Workers ferried materials across the river on barges, limestone blocks quarried upstate, steel beams forged in Pennsylvania foundries, cement mixed on the island itself. They worked through summers that baked the rock hot enough to burn bare feet and through winters when ice made the river impassable for weeks. They built foundations that went down to bedrock, walls that rose 50 feet, roofs that could support snow and rain and the weight of time. The construction was brutal. Men fell from scaffolding, others were crushed when ropes snapped and stones fell. Some developed lung infections from breathing stone dust day after day. They were replaced without ceremony. Francis paid well, but demanded results. The castle would be completed. Injuries were regrettable, but acceptable. Death was unfortunate, but insufficient reason to slow progress. By 1908, the main structure stood complete. The castle rose above the island like a transplanted piece of medieval Europe, anachronistic and impossible, a fortress built not for defense but for commerce, not for kings, but for a merchant who understood that presentation mattered, that customers remembered spectacle, that being dramatic was sometimes the same as being smart. Francis filled it methodically. Rifles lined walls in racks that stretched 20 feet high. Pistols filled cabinets organized by caliber, by manufacturer, by condition. Swords hung from ceiling hooks, their blades gleaming in light that entered through arrow slits. Uniforms were folded and stacked in rooms that smelled of wool and mothballs. Flags captured in forgotten wars hung limp in still air. Artillery pieces too large for the castle sat outside, arranged like a museum display. Cannons pointed at the river as if expecting attack. Mortars sat on wooden platforms. Machine guns mounted on tripods faced in all directions. Visitors arriving by boat saw first the weaponry, then the walls, then the name carved large enough to read from a mile away. They understood immediately what this place was: power contained. Bannerman advertised in newspapers and magazines. His catalogs were elaborate, hundreds of pages describing available inventory with the enthusiasm of a man selling not death but collectibles, historical artifacts, pieces of America's military heritage. He framed guns as investments, as art, as items any serious collector or patriotic citizen should want to own. Business thrived. Orders came from across America and from foreign governments seeking cheap weapons for colonial ventures or internal conflicts. Francis shipped rifles to South America, pistols to Asia, artillery to Africa. He asked no questions about intended use. His business was supply. What customers did with purchases was their concern, not his. He was a merchant, not a moralist. The island became famous. Tour boats began including it on routes up the Hudson. Guides pointed it out to passengers, telling them about the eccentric businessman who built a castle to store guns, about the millions of dollars in weapons sitting on that rock, about the danger and the audacity and the sheer American ambition of the whole enterprise. Passengers photographed it, wrote about it in letters home, remembered it as one of the strangest things they had ever seen. Francis lived in Brooklyn but visited the island regularly, taking a private boat across the river to inspect inventory, to meet clients, to walk through his creation and feel satisfaction that what he imagined had become real. He was not a violent man. He sold weapons but rarely fired them. His interest was commercial, not martial. Guns were products. Violence was someone else's problem. He hired guards to live on the island year-round, men who patrolled the grounds with dogs, who watched for thieves approaching by boat, who kept fires burning in winter to prevent pipes from freezing. They lived in small cottages built near the castle, isolated from the world, their only company each other and the thousands of guns surrounding them. The work was lonely. Guards reported hearing strange sounds at night, creaking that might have been wind or might have been the castle settling or might have been something else. They reported seeing lights moving inside the castle when no one was there, reflections that did not match any lamp or lantern. Some quit after a few months. Others stayed for years, growing accustomed to isolation, to the weight of living among so much potential violence. How much does one breath cost on an island built to store instruments of death? How much does sleep cost when you bed down knowing that beneath your feet sit tons of explosives, that one spark could turn everything into fire, that the castle protecting you could become your tomb? The guards did not ask these questions. They accepted wages and did their jobs and tried not to think about what failure would mean. Francis expanded constantly. He built additional structures, a residence for himself, larger cottages for guards, a boathouse, storage sheds, the island filled with buildings, with walls, with battlements, with the physical manifestation of one man's peculiar vision. By 1915, Bannerman's castle was not just a warehouse, but a complex, a facility, a self-contained world devoted entirely to commerce and weapons. Then came the explosion, not the one in 1920. That came later. The first explosion happened in 1918, smaller, contained, caused by mishandling of old ammunition. It damaged one storage room, killed 2 guards, sent smoke billowing from a tower window. Francis had it repaired quickly, reinforced walls, implemented new safety protocols, and continued business as usual. But the incident worried him. He was 67 years old. The business had made him wealthy beyond the dreams of that Scottish boy who immigrated to Brooklyn. Perhaps it was time to slow down, to sell some inventory, to reduce the risk. But he could not bring himself to stop. The castle was his legacy. The business was his identity. To stop would be to admit mortality, to acknowledge limits. And Francis Bannerman acknowledged nothing except profit margins and inventory counts. He died in 1918, before he could act on any concerns, before he could secure the island, before he could prevent what would come. His sons inherited the business, inherited the island, inherited the castle filled with enough weapons and explosives to level a mountain. They continued operations, continued buying and selling, continued believing that walls thick enough and procedures careful enough could contain anything. They were wrong. On August 19, 1920, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when summer heat made the air shimmer and the river moved sluggish and slow, something went wrong inside the castle. Perhaps a spark from a dropped tool, perhaps spontaneous combustion of old powder, perhaps simple bad luck, the universe deciding that this place had stood long enough. The initial explosion was small, localized to one room on the second floor where ammunition was stored. But small did not matter. Small was enough. The blast ignited adjacent materials. Fire spread faster than men could run, faster than water could flow from hoses, faster than anyone could react. Within minutes, the entire second floor was burning. Within an hour, the castle was an inferno. Guards tried to fight it. They formed bucket brigades, hauled water from the river, threw it uselessly against flames that laughed at their effort. They tried to evacuate inventory, carrying crates of rifles toward boats. An explosion knocked 3 men into the water. They did not surface. The boats pulled away, abandoning the island, abandoning the castle, abandoning everything because staying meant dying. The fire burned for 3 days, smoke visible from Albany to New York City. Flames so bright they lit the river at night, turned darkness into terrible noon, cast shadows that danced across water and shoreline. Explosions continued randomly. A burst of ammunition here, a cache of grenades there, artillery shells detonating with sounds like cannon fire, like the castle was fighting a war against itself. People gathered on both shores to watch. They stood silent, awed, horrified, unable to look away from the spectacle of so much destruction, so much beauty in the burning, so much money turning to ash and smoke. Photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers across America, the castle in flames, towers silhouetted against fire, walls standing while everything behind them burned. When the flames finally exhausted themselves, when nothing combustible remained, when the fire died because there was nothing left to kill, the castle stood changed. The walls remained, the towers remained, the battlements remained, but they were hollow now, emptied, gutted. The interior was gone completely. Floors had collapsed, roofs had caved in. The metal and wood and fabric that filled the spaces between stones had vaporized, leaving only the skeleton, the shell, the ghost of what had been. The Bannerman sons surveyed the damage. Millions of dollars in inventory destroyed. Weapons that could never be recovered or replaced lost to fire and river. The castle itself, while structurally standing, was ruined beyond practical use. They could rebuild. They could refill. But the cost would be enormous, the risk obvious. Insurance companies refused to cover the island. Banks refused to finance reconstruction. The castle had become a liability. They made repairs where possible, shoring up walls that threatened collapse, removing debris, salvaging what little inventory had survived in peripheral buildings untouched by the main fire. But their hearts were not in it. The castle's magic had died with the explosion. What remained was ruin, reminder, memorial to hubris and to the simple fact that some things cannot be contained, that walls thick enough to stop artillery cannot stop fire, that fortresses built to hold violence eventually become violent themselves. Business continued at reduced scale. The Bannermans moved most operations back to Brooklyn, keeping only minimal staff on the island, using undamaged structures for limited storage. The castle stood empty, a shell inhabited only by wind and birds and the ghosts of what it had been. Tour boats still passed, still pointed it out, but now as a cautionary tale, as proof that ambition without humility leads to fire. Francis's grandsons tried to maintain it. They understood the castle's historical value, its uniqueness, its place in American imagination, but maintenance was expensive and generated no revenue. Each winter brought new damage: ice-cracked stones, water seeped into cracks and froze, expanding, widening gaps. Vegetation took root in mortar, roots prying apart blocks. The river itself eroded foundations, patient and relentless as time. In 1969, another fire swept the island, this one of unknown origin, possibly started by trespassers or by lightning. It consumed what remained of the wooden structures, destroyed the residence Francis had built, left only the castle and a few stone outbuildings. The fires seemed drawn to the island as if the place called to flame, as if having burned once it would burn forever, recurring cycles of destruction that could not be stopped or explained. The family finally abandoned it. They could not sell it. Who would buy a ruin on an island accessible only by boat, burdened with history and haunted by fire? They donated it to the state of New York in 1967, washed their hands of responsibility, let government decide what to do with Francis Bannerman's dream turned nightmare. The state did nothing. The island became forbidden territory, officially closed to public access because the structures were dangerous, because walls could collapse without warning, because liability in America matters more than history or preservation. Signs were posted, fences erected, guards hired to patrol and turn away boats carrying curious trespassers who wanted to walk through ruins and feel what remained. But ruins have gravity. They pull. They attract exactly the people warnings are meant to repel. Photographers came by kayak in early morning mist, capturing images of walls emerging from fog. Artists came to sketch, to paint, to try capturing the melancholy beauty of a castle built to last forever that lasted barely 20 years. Historians came to document, to photograph every stone before time took it, to preserve in archives what could not be preserved in reality. And the castle stood, diminished each year, eroded each season, more broken, more hollow, more beautiful in its destruction than it ever was complete. The walls that survived the explosion continued surviving everything else: storms, ice, time, neglect. They stood because Francis built them well, because the stone was good, because sometimes things endure not despite tragedy but because of it, hardened by fire, strengthened by loss, made permanent by the very forces that tried to destroy them. The fortress exploded from within, but the explosion did not end it, did not erase it. The fortress remains, will remain, stands even now on its island in the river, visible to trains passing on the eastern shore, visible to boats moving north and south, visible to anyone who looks and sees not just ruin, but defiance, not just destruction, but the refusal to disappear, not just ending, but the strange, terrible persistence of things built strong enough that even their deaths cannot kill them completely. The years after abandonment were not kind, but ruins do not expect kindness. They expect only what time gives: rain that softens mortar, frost that cracks stone, wind that carries away pieces so small no one notices until suddenly a section of wall that stood for decades simply isn't there anymore. Gone, returned to the river as sediment. By 1970, the castle had become a skeleton. Windows that once held glass now framed emptiness. Doorways led to rooms that no longer existed. Staircases climbed to floors that had collapsed, their upper sections jutting into air like broken fingers pointing at nothing. Ivy claimed the walls, green tendrils working into cracks, roots dissolving mortar grain by grain. The island itself grew wild. Without guards to maintain paths, without workers to trim vegetation, nature reclaimed what had briefly been tamed. Trees sprouted from soil thin as prayer. Bushes thick with thorns blocked passages between buildings. Poison ivy covered everything, its leaves turning brilliant red each autumn, a fire that didn't burn but marked the island as untouchable, as cursed, as belonging now to something other than human ambition. Photographers who came illegally, who paddled kayaks across the river in darkness and climbed onto the island before dawn, found a landscape both beautiful and ominous. The castle at sunrise, mist rising from the river, light touching the highest battlements first, then sliding down walls like water. It was the kind of beauty that hurt to witness, that made the chest tight, that reminded observers of mortality, and the absolute certainty that everything ends, everything crumbles, everything returns to the elements from which it came. They photographed obsessively, the way light moved through empty windows, the texture of stone eroded by a century of weather, the trees growing impossibly from cracks where no soil should exist, the shadows that pulled in corners and never quite left even at noon. Their images circulated online, in galleries, in books about ruins and decay and the aesthetic of abandonment. Bannerman's castle became famous again, not for what it was, but for what it had become. Urban explorers came next, a different breed than photographers. They came for the thrill of trespassing, of entering forbidden spaces, of standing where signs said not to stand. They climbed walls, explored basements half filled with water, carved their names into stones that had survived explosion and fire and decades of neglect. Some fell, some were injured. Some had to be rescued by police boats, sheepish and bandaged, fined for trespassing, and lucky to be alive. The state tried to secure the island. They installed better fencing, hired more patrol boats, prosecuted trespassers more aggressively. But islands surrounded by water are impossible to truly seal. Someone determined enough will always find a way, and the castle called to them, promised them something: experience, adventure, photographs worth the risk, the story they could tell of the time they walked through Bannerman's castle and touched walls that held a century of violence and fire. Preservationists emerged, a small group who believed the castle worth saving. They formed a trust, raised money, negotiated with the state for permission to stabilize the ruins. Not to rebuild. Rebuilding was impossible, too expensive, too removed from what the castle had become, but to preserve, to prevent further collapse, to ensure that what remained would remain a while longer. They worked carefully, respectfully. They brought engineers who assessed which walls were stable and which threatened collapse. They brought masons who repointed mortar using techniques and materials matching the original construction. They brought historians who documented every stone, every marking, every piece of graffiti carved by visitors over decades, treating it all as part of the castle's story, as layers of history that deserved preservation. The work was slow. Money came in small amounts from grants, donations, fundraisers. Volunteers gave weekends hauling materials across the river, mixing mortar, cleaning debris from interiors that had become dumping grounds for branches and leaves and the nests of animals that had claimed the ruins as habitat. Birds roosted in towers, bats hung from ceilings that remained, snakes sunned themselves on stones still warm from explosions that happened a century ago. In 2007, a significant section of the southern wall collapsed during a storm. The sound echoed across the valley, a deep groan followed by the crash of stones, hitting earth, hitting water. When preservationists arrived to assess damage, they found 30 feet of wall simply gone, reduced to rubble, irretrievable. They photographed the collapse, documented the loss, and continued their work, understanding now what they perhaps hadn't before. They would lose this battle. Time and gravity and entropy would win. Their job was not to prevent the castle's death, but to slow it, to buy years or decades, to ensure that the death would be gradual rather than sudden, witnessed rather than ignored. Tour boats began stopping near the island, not landing but idling in the current while guides explained the history over loudspeakers. Tourists photographed from the water, their images showing the castle from angles Francis Bannerman would recognize, imposing, dramatic, unmistakable. The name Bannerman carved into the facade had partially collapsed, letters incomplete now, but still readable, still declaring ownership even though the owner was long dead and the owned was slowly dying. What does it mean to preserve a ruin? The question haunted those who worked on the island. Ruins exist in a state between being and non-being, between structure and collapse. To preserve them is to freeze them in that moment, to say, this much destruction, and no more, this much death, and no further. But ruins want to continue ruining. That is their nature. To stop them is to transform them into something else, something that is no longer quite ruin and no longer quite building, but something suspended, artificial, a museum exhibit of decay rather than decay itself. The preservationists did their best. They installed drainage to channel water away from foundations. They removed vegetation that threatened to pull walls apart. They reinforced sections most at risk of collapse. They created viewing platforms on the island's edges where people could stand safely and look at the castle without entering it, without touching it, without adding their own small contributions to its destruction. In 2009, the state began allowing limited, supervised tours. Groups of 20, accompanied by guides, could visit the island twice monthly during summer, could walk established paths, could enter certain areas deemed safe. The tours sold out immediately, months in advance, filled with people who wanted to experience the castle before it disappeared, who understood that what they saw would not exist forever, might not exist much longer, and wanted to witness it while witnessing remained possible. Those who walked through the ruins reported strange sensations. Coldness in places that should have been warm, the feeling of being watched from empty windows, a pressure in the chest, a tightness in the throat, a sadness that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. Some called it haunted, others called it memory. Still others said the castle simply held on to what happened there, held on to the explosion and the fire and the deaths and the slow decline, and that proximity to such concentrated history affected people, made them feel things that had no rational explanation, but were real nonetheless. Guards who worked on the island talked carefully about what they experienced, not because they feared being disbelieved, but because some things resist language, live in the space between words. They spoke of mornings when mist made the castle appear to float, of evenings when sunset turned the walls red as fire, of nights when they were certain they heard sounds from inside the ruins, footsteps, voices, the scrape of metal on stone. But investigation found nothing, revealed no source, left them standing in darkness listening to silence that felt occupied. One guard, who worked 5 summers on the island, said it simply, "The castle remembers. I don't know what that means. I don't know how stone remembers, but it does. You feel it when you're there. You feel it watching. You feel it holding on to something it won't let go." He quit after a wall collapsed 10 feet from where he stood, said he had used his luck and wouldn't test it further. Storms tested the castle annually. Each hurricane season brought winds that screamed through empty windows, rain that pounded walls, floods that turned the island into barely visible land in a swollen river. Each winter brought ice that formed in cracks and expanded, splitting stones along fault lines invisible until suddenly visible, suddenly terminal. Each spring brought inspections, assessments, repairs, and the growing understanding that repairs were temporary, that they delayed but did not prevent, that the castle's fate was decided the moment the explosion hollowed it out and left only shells where substance had been. Artists continued coming, drawn by the aesthetic of destruction, by the romance of ruins, by the opportunity to create work in dialogue with decay. They painted the castle in oils that captured the texture of crumbling stone. They photographed it in black and white that emphasized shadow and absence. They made sculptures from stones that had fallen, from metal corroded by a century of weather, from fragments that once were whole and now were only pieces, only reminders of what had been lost. A filmmaker came in 2012, made a documentary about the castle's history, about Francis Bannerman's ambition, about the explosion, about the slow death that followed. He interviewed descendants of men who worked on the island, who guarded it, who were there when it burned. He collected photographs from attics and archives, images showing the castle in its glory, showing the fire, showing the aftermath. His film premiered at festivals, won awards, brought renewed attention to a place most Americans had never heard of and now couldn't forget. The attention helped and hurt. It brought donations, volunteers, political will to preserve what remained, but it also brought more trespassers, more people who saw the documentary and decided they needed to see the real thing, needed to touch those walls, needed to stand where history happened. The state increased patrols, fines increased. Still people came, drawn by something stronger than law or common sense, or the very real danger of standing beneath walls that could collapse without warning. What called them? Different people gave different answers. Some said history, the desire to connect with the past, to stand where others stood, to touch what they touched. Some said beauty, the undeniable aesthetic power of ruins, the way destruction can create forms more striking than anything deliberate design achieves. Some said darkness, the human fascination with tragedy, with death, with places where violence occurred and left its mark in stone and metal and earth. Perhaps all were correct. Perhaps the castle contained multitudes, meant different things to different observers, held enough complexity that everyone who looked found something that resonated with them, something that made the risk worthwhile, the trespass necessary, the encounter with ruins a kind of pilgrimage to a shrine that honored not gods but time, not faith but the certainty that everything fails, everything falls, everything returns to component elements and scatters. In 2015, a major stabilization project began. Engineers installed steel supports inside the most fragile sections, bolting them to bedrock, creating internal skeletons that would hold walls upright even as mortar continued failing. The work was controversial. Purists argued that ruins should be allowed to ruin, that intervention transformed authentic decay into stage preservation, that steel supports were lies, pretending the castle was something it was no longer. Others argued that without intervention, the castle would collapse completely within a decade, that future generations deserved the chance to see it, that preservation honored Francis Bannerman's memory and the men who died building it and guarding it and fighting the fire that consumed it. The debate was passionate, philosophical, ultimately unresolvable because both sides were correct, both honored different values, both wanted to protect something precious but disagreed on what precious meant. The work proceeded. Steel beams rose inside hollow towers. Cables connected walls to bedrock. Drainage systems channeled water away from vulnerable sections. The castle began to resemble a patient in intensive care, kept alive by technology, by intervention, by the determination of people who loved it enough to fight for its survival, even knowing survival might be temporary, might last only years or decades before time exhausted all options, and the castle finally surrendered to gravity and entropy and the river that waited patiently below. Tours expanded, the island opened more frequently, welcomed larger groups, guides refined their presentations, learned to tell the story in ways that honored complexity, that acknowledged the moral ambiguity of a man who made his fortune selling weapons, that didn't shy from the violence the castle represented even as they celebrated its architectural audacity and the strange beauty of its ruins. Visitors walked paths that wound through the complex, past the castle, past the remains of other buildings, past the boathouse where boats once docked and now only foundations remained. They stood at viewing platforms and photographed walls that looked solid from distance but up close revealed their fragility, revealed the gaps and cracks and spaces where stone had simply vanished, molecule by molecule, grain by grain, stolen by wind and rain and time. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Why did it explode? Why didn't they rebuild it? Why does it look so sad? The guides did their best explaining fire and economics and the nature of ruins, but some questions had no good answers, existed in territory where facts were insufficient, and only poetry or silence seemed adequate. The castle appeared in films, in television shows, in video games that needed dramatic locations for post-apocalyptic scenarios or historical fantasies. It became shorthand for decay, for the American capacity to build enormously and abandon completely, for the way the nation's history is written in ruins scattered across the landscape, each telling a story of ambition that exceeded wisdom, of construction that preceded understanding, of consequences that arrived decades after decisions that caused them. Francis Bannerman would not recognize what his castle became. He built it as advertisement, as warehouse, as monument to commerce and capability. It became instead a monument to failure, to the limits of control, to the certainty that what we build will outlast us but not forever, will stand for a while then fall, will be remembered but not as we hoped, will mean things we never intended and cannot prevent. The irony was perfect. A man who made his fortune selling instruments of destruction built a fortress to contain them, and the fortress was destroyed by what it contained. The explosion was not attack but suicide, not external violence but internal combustion, the castle killing itself with the very materials it was designed to protect. There is something almost mythological in that, almost Greek. Hubris punished, ambition consuming itself, the builder destroyed by his creation. But Francis died before the explosion. He was spared witnessing his life's work consumed by fire, spared knowing that the castle he built to last centuries would barely last 2 decades before becoming exactly what it is now, a shell, a ghost, a memory in stone. His sons witnessed it, his grandsons inherited the aftermath. They carried the weight of preserving something that resisted preservation, of maintaining something that wanted to collapse, of loving something that hurt to love. The island changed with seasons. Spring brought leaves that softened the harsh stone, turned the ruins green and almost alive. Summer brought heat that baked the rock, made the air shimmer, made the castle appear to waver as if not quite solid, not quite real. Fall brought color, trees turning red and gold, creating beauty almost painful in its intensity, beauty that existed briefly then died, like everything else. Winter was hardest. The island in winter was barren, hostile, a place where nothing lived that didn't have to, where only the castle stood against wind that screamed across the frozen river, where ice formed on walls and made them glitter like the fortress was studded with diamonds, beautiful and cold and deadly in its beauty. Guards stopped working the island in winter. The risks were too great. Ice made paths treacherous. Cold made collapses more likely as frozen water expanded in cracks and split stones. The island was left to itself, to the elements, to whatever spirits or memories inhabited it. In spring, guards returned and assessed damage, cataloged what winter had taken, planned repairs that would never quite restore what was lost. Occasionally, someone drowned trying to reach the island. The river looked calm but held currents strong enough to pull swimmers under, cold enough to stop hearts within minutes. Bodies washed up downstream, identified from licenses in waterproof bags, mourned by families who couldn't understand why someone would risk death to visit ruins, who didn't comprehend the pull such places exert, the gravity of decay, the way some people need to witness endings, need to stand in the presence of destruction and feel something they cannot name or explain. Each death brought renewed calls to demolish the castle, to eliminate the danger, to prevent future tragedies. But the preservationists fought back, argued that the solution was not destruction but education, not elimination but better security. They installed more warning signs, more fencing, more cameras. They worked with police to patrol more aggressively. They did everything possible except the one thing that would absolutely work. They did not destroy the castle. They could not. It meant too much. It was too important. It was too beautiful in its brokenness to erase. And so, the castle stands. Stands now in this moment as you read this. Stands on its island in the Hudson River. Stands hollow and broken and magnificent. Stands as testament to ambition and failure, to construction and destruction, to the human need to build big and the universe's indifference to our needs. Stands because stone is patient and gravity is slow, and even though the end is certain, the end has not yet arrived. How long will it stand? No one knows. Engineers offer estimates. 20 years, 50, a century if stabilization efforts continue and funding doesn't disappear. But estimates are guesses, educated but ultimately unprovable until time proves them. The castle may stand another 100 years. It may collapse next winter when ice cracks what remains fragile. It may stand forever, or what passes for forever in human timescales, until the river itself changes course or rises high enough to swallow the island and everything on it. What matters is not how long, but what it means while it stands. Every person who sees it, who photographs it, who thinks about it, adds meaning. Every artist who paints it, every writer who describes it, every filmmaker who captures it, adds layers to its significance. The castle has become more than stone and mortar. It has become idea, symbol, metaphor for everything that burns bright and burns out, everything that reaches high and falls hard, everything that was meant to last and didn't. Time does not destroy walls. Time erases names. Francis Bannerman's name is still there, carved into the facade, partially collapsed but readable. How much longer before the letters crumble completely, before the name disappears, before the castle becomes anonymous, attributed to no one, built by ghosts, haunted by ghosts, remembered by no one except those who study ruins and learn to read history in broken stone? The preservationists know they are fighting a battle they will eventually lose, but they fight anyway, not because they believe they can win, but because the fighting matters, because effort matters, because the years they buy, the decades they purchase with their labor and money and love, those years matter to everyone who sees the castle in them, who experiences something that would not exist without their work. There is nobility in that. Nobility in caring for things that cannot be saved but can be slowed. Nobility in loving ruins enough to preserve them, even knowing preservation is temporary, is itself a kind of ruin, is the slow management of collapse rather than its prevention. They are hospice workers for architecture, midwives for death, witnesses to the long goodbye between a castle and the world. The castle stands, against river, against time, against gravity, against sense. It stands hollow and gutted, empty of everything except its own history, its own memory, its own stubborn refusal to fall until falling becomes the only option. It stands because walls built strong enough survive explosions. It stands because stone outlasts flesh. It stands because endings take longer than beginnings, because destruction is slower than construction, because falling is sometimes the longest journey anything takes. And it will continue standing, not forever. Nothing stands forever. But for now, for today, for this moment and the next and the ones after that, stretching forward into a future that will eventually arrive at the moment when the last wall falls, when the last stone returns to earth, when the island returns to being just an island, unmarked and unnamed and empty of everything except the foundation stones too deep to see, too heavy to move, too permanent to erase. Those stones will remain. Long after the visible castle is gone, after tourists stop coming, after the river changes course, after everyone alive today is dead and their children are dead and their children's children are dead, those foundation stones will remain, buried, forgotten, holding up nothing, supporting no structure, bearing no weight except the weight of their own existence and the ghost weight of everything that once stood above them. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what endurance means. Not standing forever, but leaving something, leaving evidence, leaving foundations that prove something once existed here, something ambitious and flawed and beautiful in its way, something that exploded from within and still refused to disappear, something built by a man who sold death and built a fortress to contain it and learned, too late or perhaps at exactly the right time, that death cannot be contained, that fire goes where it wants, that all castles are temporary and all ambitions end in ruins. The fortress exploded from within. The fortress survived. The fortress stands, will stand, stood, stands now. Empty of everything except memory. Hollow of everything except history. Dead of everything except the strange life ruins have. The half-life of structures caught between being and non-being, between past and present, between what was and what remains. Bannerman's Castle. The name itself is a ghost carved into stone that crumbles, letter by letter, year by year, until someday the name will be unreadable and the castle will be just a castle, just a ruin, just stones on an island in a river, just evidence that someone once built something here, something tall and proud and doomed from the moment they imagined it could last. But it did last, does last, will last, as long as stone can stand, as long as memory can hold, as long as people care enough to visit, to photograph, to write about, to preserve what cannot ultimately be preserved but deserves the attempt, deserves the effort, deserves to be loved in its broken state, deserves to be witnessed in its slow dying, deserves to be remembered not for what it was, but for what it became, and what it is, and what it will be, until it isn't anything except earth and water and the stories people tell about the castle that exploded from within and refused, for 100 years and counting, to let that explosion be the end.